we are now at 10:15 for us in the UK. So I suppose it could be good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everybody. And yeah, I will just quickly give you a brief background on Andrew himself before I hand over to him. So Andrew is a technical content manager for English language at Trinity College London, has over 2 decades experience teaching EFL and EAP in Europe, South Korea and Britain. His dissertation on task types in listening tests was highly commended by the IELTS Research Committee. And today he will be focusing on comparing multiple choice and open-ended items in listening tests and the implications for testers and teachers. So I will hand over to you, Andrew.
All right, thanks very much, Florence, for that introduction. And this title of this presentation today is something which has been both an academic and a professional interest for me. And it, in one way, it taps into some quite wide questions on what testers and also teachers who think for any amount of time about listening in the classroom or in testing sort of wonder sometimes what's going on when we're listening in our brains and what's going on in the students' or candidates' brains when they're listening, and what's going on when they're learning to listen, and how do we test how well they listen. When we're testing that, what should we attend to? And when we're teaching that, again, what should we attend to? So these are kind of the big questions that I was interested in, and I'm sure the people listening to this presentation are interested in. But of course, this was based on a master's degree and a much narrower kind of set of questions. But still, I think that it possibly some of what I read about and also some of what I found in the research might also shed a bit of light on some of those wider questions too. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, both the wider thing and the more specific questions I've looked at. So yeah, I will start just with a brief talk about what listening actually is. And then I'm going to talk for a little bit about the item types as a tester I was interested in, and some of the ways in which I compared them, and what I found and why that was interesting. And then I'm going to finish with some of the implications both for testers. I'm sure lots of people listening are testers, but also for teachers. So the first question then is, what is listening? And the kind of simplest, one of the simplest and still really one of the best definitions of listening, and I think this was in Rust, but it's something very intuitive as well, is that listening is hearing plus attention. So at the same time, it's kind of a physiological or physical activity, hearing, and it's a cognitive activity, turning your attention together. And when you put those two things together, that's when you've got listening. Rust, by the way, notes, and this became important in my research, that understanding when you're listening to something happens on a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. You can listen and understand everything, most things, some things, or nothing, or you can misunderstand what you hear. Okay, of course, I think if I stopped there and said, okay, let's have a theory of listening, it's hearing and attention, you probably wouldn't quite be satisfied with that, and I wouldn't blame you. So let's have a look at a slightly more a richer model of what's happening when we're listening. So here's a diagram. Don't try and look at it all at once. This diagram combines elements from Michael Rost, who wrote a lot about listening in teaching and researching, and also some insights from John Field, who, like me, is interested in language tests, listening tests, and wrote some very useful and interesting books on the topic. And so turn your attention first to the center of the diagram, because what this shows is what researchers believe are a number of kind of concurrent cognitive processes that occur during the process of listening. And we can divide those broadly into two sets. At the bottom there, you have the what we might call the lower processes, the decoding processes, phonological decoding, like actually hearing those sounds, lexical matching those sounds to words that you know, and syntactical parsing, putting those together into kind of meaningful sentences. And then you've got the higher processes, which are all to do with the construction of meaning. What does this mean? What's the writer's intention, right? What's the pragmatic meaning? What's the point of this utterance? What's the point of this, recording that I'm listening to? How does it fit into a wider discourse? What's it kind of adding to the subject? And so all of these things are going on when we listen, and they're both simultaneous, and yet they're also hierarchical. Yeah, they're all like simpler processes and more complicated processes, but they support each other. For example, if you've got more awareness of the wider meaning or the context, that actually can support gaps in phonological decoding and so on. If you look at the right-hand side of the diagram, you've got this key faculty, which is attention. So how we listen, what we're listening to, is directed by our attention, our point of view, our purpose for listening. And when we're in a test, not only when we're in a test, when we're in a testing situation, we might also have a deliberate strategy for listening. So for example, we might attend to particular words when we're at a railway station, or we might be looking for a particular answer when we're in a test, or we might be trying to figure out the speaker's attitude. Okay, so that is directing how we listen. And there are other cognitive faculties involved when we're listening to. We have that what we call working memory. What you can keep in your head at the moment is your working memory. We have language knowledge. You can't do this lexical matching or this syntactical parsing without some grammatical or vocabulary knowledge, implicit or explicit. And of course, your real world knowledge, especially when you get to become a more proficient listener. I didn't mention, by the way, one very important kind of source when it comes to strategies, which was it is in my it's in my reference list at the end of this, but Van de Grift and Go have got a very good kind of like taxonomy of listening strategies, which are relevant both to teaching and testing. And sorry, I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so here's the theory. Why is this important? Is this important? Well, I think so. Why is it important for testers? Well, Cyril Weir makes the case that if we want, and we have to remember that when we're testing, we're always thinking about validity. Is this a valid test? Is this really testing what we think it's testing in kind of a fair way, and a kind of authentic way? Now, if we really want to do that, then we have to understand the processes going on when somebody's listening. And he calls that theory-based validity, or other people call that cognitive validity. So we're testing in a valid way. For teachers, well, of course, it's important that they understand learner cognition. They understand, where is the learner on the journey. Oh, by the way, John Field argued that when we're looking at, I said by the way, but this is actually a quite important point. When we're looking at learners at the kind of B1 to B2 level, which is kind of where the divide is for people going to university and so on, we start to turn our attention seriously from the lower processes to the higher processes, and he thinks tests should reflect that. So there's a bit of a jump around the B1 to B2 level. He doesn't call it Field's jump, but that's what I've called it in this PowerPoint. And obviously, for any teachers in the audience, what we find in language testing research is useful to know. And I'll reflect on that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. Okay, so those are the listening processes in a very summary way. And if we want to know how we're testing is valid, or how we're teaching is valid, we have to keep these things in mind. Now, the particular thing that I wanted to look at when I was doing some research was two particular items, which are multiple choice questions and shorter open-ended questions. Now, you might ask, why these? Very simply, these are very common items used in standardized testing. They're some of the easiest to mark because the answers are standardized as opposed to questions with longer answers. You'll be very familiar with the structure, but we'll go through that. There's a question on the left of the screen. Which actor was briefly a teacher in Newcastle upon Tyne? One of these answers is the key. It's Liam Neeson, by the way. And the other three are, we call them distractors, the wrong options, and they're quite plausible, notice, and they all have something in common. They're all Irishmen, Irish actors, but only one of them was a teacher once in Newcastle upon Tyne. Okay, so question, key, distractors. An open-ended question doesn't give you any answers. You just have to listen and find the answer. So let's imagine you're at a geography lesson and it's about Ireland, and the question is, or the test question is, which county is the geographical centre of Ireland in? That can also be phrased as so. The geographical centre of Ireland can be found in the county of blank. And that's a short answer because the answer is going to be a county. So it's going to be just one or two words. If anyone's curious about that, by the way, the answer is Westmeath, County Westmeath. And just as an interesting side note, the word Meath is from a Gaelic word meaning middle. So you could have guessed that. I've put an example of an open-ended question which requires a longer answer at the bottom. These are harder to use in tests because the answer would have to be a proposition, and the amount of variety in the possible answers would be very difficult to mark. Why did Liam Neeson stop teaching? There must be a lot of different ways to express that, and possibly a lot of different answers too. So I wanted to compare these, and I wanted to know what was going on kind of cognitively in test takers' minds when they were doing this. In fact, I had 3 specific questions. Are the item types comparably, or if you want, comparably, difficult and discriminating? How well must test takers understand the input before they can answer each item type? So what I'm interested in there is, do you need to know the answer? Do you need to have understood what you listened to before you answer the question? And is that the same for each item type? And what range of strategies and tactics, I've used the word approaches for that together, do test takers access when answering each item type? That's what I wanted to know. How could I find that out? Well, I started with some tests and used my contacts at Trinity College London, who are hosting this conference where I work, to give me some testlets. That's like one part of a test. That's what we call them, testlets. And they all had multiple choice questions with them. So what I did is for each of the questions, I wrote an open-ended version of the question. Or should I say that for about half of the items, I wrote an open-ended equivalent of the same question. So it had exactly the same question and more or less the same answer. But I should say the same question and the same answer. But it's not always possible to make the conversion, because items where some kind of inference was involved or some kind of evaluation, they often had longer options, and they couldn't easily be converted into an open-ended question, because of course the shorter open-ended questions which I was testing needed a short answer. So I replaced those with kind of non-direct equivalents. And this kind of note of the slightly less flexible nature of short open-ended items was something that I'd also seen in the literature, and that they tend to test words and phrases, local rather than global understanding, obviously because the words or phrases have to be from the text, the recorded text, and the answer has to be short. I've got a couple of examples of that. The first couple are ones where I could convert it. So how long did it take to build the bridge? That was easily converted. You see this, the open-ended version of that was kind of like some summary notes. Construction lasted. So you can see the key more than 7 years could also be a short answer, over 7 years. The second question, similar to that, what surprised the man when he started the job? He had to pass a test. What requirement of the job surprised the man? A test. I was quite liberal in terms of marking, by the way, for the open-ended. I had my own kind of protocol for that, for whether it was comprehensible on the one hand and whether it showed understanding on the other hand. So somebody could understand it and it showed the candidate had understood. The last example is one which I couldn't directly convert. Why does the woman feel they would be good explorers? This was kind of an inference question. You couldn't get the answer directly by listening. So I had to, and the idea was their teacher had given positive comments about researching, about their research skills. So I had to reword that question, and it really changed the nature of the question. From kind of like a more inferential question to a more specific. Okay, so but I ended up with a set of questions where I had the same amount of open-ended and the same amount of multiple choice questions. So like 20 of each with equivalents. And I sorted them into two sets. So set A had multiple choice questions, sets 1 and 2, and their equivalents of open-ended questions were in set B. And then set A had open-ended questions 3 and 4, and their equivalents of multiple choice questions were in set B. And all the students that I gave this to at a UK university EAP centre either took set A or set B. And that allowed me to compare both the different item types, how did those how different sets of students deal with those questions, but also for the same students, how did they deal with the type itself within the set that they did. So the test was followed by an additional listen. They'd been kind of marking their answer in black pen. I took all the black pens off them and gave them red pens. And then we did a kind of coding exercise where we listened again, and for each answer, they had to tell me how much had they understood the input for that and what strategy did they use to listen to it. So in the end, I got kind of 3 sets of data, got the actual answers where I could compare how well they'd done on each item type. I had the and I had their coding where they were giving me information for each item that they took, how well had they understood the input, and how well had they understood the input, and what strategy had they used. Now, I do have a longer slide, but in the interests of sort of time, I'm just going to summarize very generally, what I found for the first question. I do have the data if anyone's interested. But generally, I found that the multiple choice items were easier than the open-ended items, though the effect was unpredictable. So for example, I will give you a little bit of the numbers here. For set A, the average score out of 10 questions was 5.97 for multiple choice, 3.61 for open-ended. For set B, it was much closer together. That's why I mean it's kind of unpredictable. But one very marked thing was among lower level test takers, the kind of lowest third, the difference was much bigger. So in set A, kind of the average score and multiple choice for the lowest third of test takers was 4 out of 10, but for open-ended, it was 0.72. Again, it was a bit closer together in set B. The open-ended items have higher discrimination, and what that means is the open-ended items kind of sorted the best from the best, the strongest from the weakest test takers, at a much kind of sharper division. This is usually considered a good thing in testing, but there's reasons we'll look at later on where the reasons for that happening could be sometimes concerning. This, by the way, broadly supports previous research where it's generally found that open-ended questions are more difficult than multiple choice. So that wasn't really a surprise there. Nevertheless interesting, and it kind of set us up for the rest of the research. So the next thing I wanted to understand, of course, was how well must test takers understand the input before they can answer each type of question. And this goes back to Rost's point that comprehension's on a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. So if we look at the graph here, we can have people at stage 4 who fully understand. They felt that they fully understand the input for the particular item they're answering. And there are people who mostly understood it. There are people who partially understood it, and there are people who felt that they didn't understand that bit of input. By the way, we had 600 data points overall, 60 test takers, and they each answered 10 multiple choice items, and of course 10 open-ended items. So what do we see here? Have a little look at this, because we're going to look at the open-ended in just a minute, and you can play spot the difference. But we'll notice the general trends. They're not too surprising here. When people fully understand a question, the majority of them get the answer right. Yeah, that's the green. When they mostly understood, more than half of them got the answer right. But it's quite even, but more people got the answer right. When they partially understood, probably twice as many people got, or a little more, got the answer wrong. When they didn't understand, again, most people got it wrong. This was for multiple choice questions. Now, what happened for open-ended? Let's spot the difference. Well, we know that open-ended questions were harder, and that's why there's more blue here, because there were more people who got that wrong. But there's also some interesting patterns in the differences in the distribution. Yeah, same as the multiple choice, we can see that more people who felt they fully understood got it right. But the most interesting difference is these people who felt that they actually mostly understood the input, but they got the question wrong. Much more people got the question wrong. And of course, much more people who didn't understand and partially understood got the question wrong. But another interesting point to make here is this was the same audio input, and yet more people, this isn't did you understand the question, it's did you understand the input. So more people, because of the nature of the question, felt that they didn't understand the input. So what conclusions did I reach, or could we reach from that data? How can we interpret that data? Well, yes, multiple choice questions seem to be easier for those who say that they mostly understand. So it seems to support not the very strongest candidates, but the next cohort, the people who kind of do understand, but not fully. It understands those more. Open-ended is more kind of all or nothing. It's mostly those who fully understand who get the answer. Those who mostly understand tend not to. That's the discrimination there. That's the division that's happening. And test takers generally tend to report lower comprehension while doing open-ended tasks, even with the same input. And this kind of matches literature that argues that multiple choice questions do provide kind of support for understanding, backing up their understanding of the text. And sometimes kind of representing more of a confirmation than a full comprehension process. That would be a kind of more negative way to describe it. Okay, the next question I wanted to answer was what range of strategies and tactics, I've used the word approaches, do test takers access while answering the items? So again, for every answer they give, I asked them to code. How did you do this? And I based these obviously these had to be comprehensible to the test takers. They had to understand. So I didn't use, terminology like strategies or processing, but I tried to summarize different ways that people could use to answer each question. And I wanted that to be not leading. These are this is kind of the spectrum from you didn't answer to you guessed. You just used common sense. You used common knowledge. You listened to particular words, synonyms, sentences. You missed the answer, but generally understood, and so you based your answer on that, or you understood. Basically, you understood what was heard. So again, let's look at multiple choice questions there. Now, again, people who got the answer right, probably about half of all those people couldn't really identify a particular strategy. They just said, I answered based on my understanding of what I heard. But among the other strategies where quite a few people did get right answers, quite a lot of people got wrong answers as well, is they answered based on some sentences that they understood, or kind of synonyms of words in an option that they understood. We all know that kind of test-taking strategy of underlining keywords in a question and then listening out for synonyms. Maybe that's what they did. Not something I'm advocating or not advocating, but maybe that's what they did. Spot the difference again. Well, yeah, again, more blue, more wrong answers. But again, yeah, most people who got the answer right are people who just felt like they understood and weren't using a particular strategy. Although a few strategies did get right answers. So, for example, number 4, listening for particular words. That would make sense in this case, because you do have to write a particular word. Usually in this kind of sentence, you're listening for particular words. That would fit the gap. That's strategy D4. Oh, by the way, D1 shows guessing. We could see the amount of guessing was higher in open-ended. That's because the test takers were having a harder time. Of course, most of the answers were wrong, but there was overall more guessing because there was more struggling. Conclusions I reached here. Again, similarly, multiple choice items elicit and support some compensatory listening strategies that open-ended seems not to. And then across both item types, successful listening, we can see, seems to involve fewer conscious strategies. That is, they are so smoothly integrated into the act of listening that the listener does not kind of acknowledge them, or they're not aware of them, as Macaro et al. And Peters have pointed out in the past. And that kind of does, go with the idea that when you get to those higher, you're a more proficient listener. You're really concentrating on meaning. You're not down there decoding particular words and sentences. Okay. Implications for testing. So the item development stage suggested that open-ended are limited in the kind of skills and sub-skills we can test. Also, that we saw there that open-ended questions tend to be more all or nothing. This could be just from the cognitive burden of also there's the fact that you have to write and spell, a little bit more stress involved. Multiple choice questions are kind of a bit more flexible in lots of ways. We find them very useful. You can target different processes, different sub-skills and levels of understanding. And we see there, when we're especially looking at the B1, B2 divide, the importance of kind of meaning instruction at kind of higher levels. By the way, there's also something not on the slide here, but I wanted to say this idea that the multiple choice questions are offering a bit of compensatory help here. It's Cheng, who's in the references, who makes this especially. When we're outside of, when we're in the real world listening, we always have context and previous experience. We don't have that when we get this kind of isolated listening in a test. So the multiple choice questions and the extra information they provide compensates for that to some extent. Are there any implications for teaching of listening? Well, maybe. Teachers of are very worried about tests, obviously, because their students will take them. They profit by understanding tests, understanding what they're testing, not misunderstanding what we're doing and kind of encouraging kind of very limited kind of strategies. So it's important to know we are testing understanding of meaning. And I think teachers, there are lots of teachers who are very good teachers and don't bother with theory. But I also think teachers can profit by being cognizant of the processes involved in listening. I used to work at Newcastle University, and there was a very good in-sessional course there about listening, where students can listen, analyze when they're misunderstood or got an answer wrong, and they can kind of go down the processing. What did I get wrong there? Did I misunderstand a word? Did I misunderstand a sentence? And you do this kind of analysis and repair. Teaching's not like testing. You can take your time, you can do all sorts of things, and you can get down into the details and find the mistake you made very specifically. Why do you make that mistake? Also, just this general idea that, you know, one thing I think this research showed is that the more contextual information you have around something you're listening to, and the lower the cognitive burden of other things going on in your head at the time, like trying to read or trying to write, the more that supports lower but also middle range test takers. These are the references that I specifically